I turned down a company because I saw on their LinkedIn that they had someone whose title was prompt engineer. And I was just like,
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about that. Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan? Well, wherever you're at, you can like, comment, subscribe. If you're on an audio platform, rate us 5 stars. Share the podcast with your friends and coworkers, whether that's over Slack or LinkedIn or in person. Whatever works. It helps us grow. And you know what? We appreciate all of the support we get from you guys. And just before we start the podcast, announcement, not necessarily podcast related, although I guess it kind of is podcast related. I have a new job. Just to kind of catch the listeners up with the story, a couple weeks ago, I was unfortunately laid off at work. Sad. But I've been doing the big tech remote thing for a really, really long time. And we haven't talked about this too much on the podcast, but I've kind of hated all my jobs for the past 5 years or so.
I didn't know that. Oh, wow.
Oh, you didn't know that either? No, I don't. I viewed them in very much like eating your vegetables sort of way. Wow. Like it was good experience. I've got some good names on my resume. It was, you get to work on interesting technology. This last job in particular, not so much the interesting technology. I did not like what we were building, which was like an internal marketing tool. And I did not like what we were using to build it. Some people would, but like we used Rust. I did not like Rust. Ruby, I don't like Ruby. Google Cloud, I'm an AWS guy. Anyway, so, obviously like no one plans to have these things happen, but, we've been doing the big tech thing for a while. And if you've been a listener, you might think, Carter, you do the big tech thing and, live in Utah, you must be, swimming in cash, or, you must live a lavish life. And the answer is yes, but no. In that, yes, we've been making good money, but we live a fairly modest life. And so we have saved lots and lots of that money. So kind of when, I lost the job, we thought for a bit like, okay, well, what do we really want to do? And I mentioned I've been kind of working on my own startup, and that kind of really opened my eyes to what that world looks like. And I've actually had a local startup here in Utah. They've been headhunting me fairly aggressively for the past 6 months or so. And it just never made sense to join them. And kind of, when it all, when I started looking for a job, and I promised myself I would not take a job unless I was genuinely excited about it. I said for the past 5 years or so, I've made the responsible move, not the fun move. And these guys just had a really great energy. The CEO and CTO seemed like a great team. And it's a much more product-driven business. It's not kind of deep tech. I like product-driven businesses. So yeah, I took the offer from them, and I'm excited. I start
so
Monday.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this, you're listening to it on Monday. So I'm at my new job right now. And it'll be a change of pace because, again, it's like the most opposite you can get from what I've done. I've kind of exclusively worked at big companies, except that awful little startup. So we're going to hope it's not a repeat there. And so I've kind of only done big companies, and I've been remote since the pandemic. This is I'm employee number 30 at this startup. And
that's a great spot to be. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a Series A, and it's 5 days a week in person, which is a big shift.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So it's, I've always said I'm not anti-in-office. I'm anti-commute and anti-living in Seattle or San Francisco. That's just, how I feel personally. This is a 3-mile jog from my house. So
wow.
I'm just, I'm a runner. If you look in the background, you can see my marathon medals. So yeah, I'm just going to jog to and from work each day. There's a gym and a shower in the building. So
yeah, I was about to say, I was like, if I did that, I would smell like a wet dog.
Yeah.
And people would be like, oh, man. That's so cool, man. A big change for me, too. Not as exciting, I think. Or maybe, depends on what you are doing. If you maybe noticed, I have all these like instruments in the background. I've been staying
starting a band.
Yeah, I'm starting a band. Back to my college days. We've been staying with family in Texas while we've been gearing up to go to Costa Rica. And so I think the next episode we record will actually be in Costa Rica. So I will,
Very
we'll have
nice.
actually finally made it down there. So yeah, we're both making big changes. This is cool.
Big changes. This podcast had big Mountain West remote energy for a while, and now we've killed the Mountain West part of it, and now only one of us is remote.
Yeah,
But
now it's
I'm excited.
Vibe Check. It's going to be Vibe Check podcast now.
I'm excited. I think there's when we read these books, we know that a lot of our listeners have an in-office component to their jobs. And so I'm excited to kind of, as we continue reading, especially the career focused stuff, to kind of evaluate it now from an in-person perspective. I haven't been in person since before the pandemic, when I was much more junior in my career, whereas I at the startup, I have an engineering leadership role. And so it's exciting. So we'll keep you posted on how everything goes. But, I guess if I have any advice to any listeners listening, I would just really recommend that, live beneath your means, save your money. And then when unfortunate things like this happen, to our family, it wasn't like the sky was falling. And it just gave us in the past, when I've needed to find a new job, I've just been so desperate to find a new job that you kind of take whatever comes your way. That's how I wound up at the Awful Little Startup. It was so on my mind, like job. I need a new job. And then, but this time we just had plenty of money, and we said, let's take it easy. Let's wait and figure out what we actually want to do. And I had a couple offers. I actually had 3 offers without ever sending out my resume. That's the other thing you should do. You should have a strong resume and work hard, so that when this happens, it stings a little less.
It's wonderful to hear that too, because I haven't, this isn't a humble brag or anything. You get to a certain point in your career, and these options start coming up. I feel so bad for folks in their early career.
Yeah,
who it seems like it's a brutal time to be a junior dev right now, and I have a lot of empathy for what's going on. And it really is. I think finding the folks to believe in you early in your career is tough, and it feels brutal. It feels unfair. But once you do break through and you've kind of proven yourself for a little bit, these kind of things, like I think where Carter's in his career, and where I've been in my career for the last probably 5 or 6 years, it was that it shifts, and it's weird, and it doesn't seem fair because you're like, wait a minute, all these people are struggling, but I've got people quietly reaching out about jobs they don't list online even, right? Like it's really, really strange. But yeah, things are there. And I think, Carter, it'll be really cool. I bet you're going to go back to some of our old episodes, especially on
I bet so, yeah.
fundamentals of software architecture and stuff. When you go, you know what? I know why we built it this way, when there was 15 people here, but we have 30, and this process really needs to come in. And how do I do a Conway, inverse Conway maneuver to help, free this up? And that'll be a fun kind of problem to work on.
Yeah. I'm excited to revisit some of the stuff. And what was I going to say? No, I think just with work, it's tough. It's tough at the beginning. If there's any junior engineers out there listening, or any engineers, my advice is always just try to structure your career and your resume in a way that makes you interesting and makes you stand out from other candidates.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's easy in that maybe you've worked at some big companies and that have a good brand name. But there are also other things. I'll say every single person I talked to throughout this whole interviewing process with a couple of companies, very impressed by the podcast. So
cool.
Go out and start your own podcast where you read a software engineering book once a week. We should make like a pyramid scheme of podcasts.
Yeah. We'll have an affiliate marketing where you read them, and then we get a cut of what.
Yeah.
No, I'm just joking. Just joking.
So that's not a podcast, but I think if that's I think Adrienne Braganza, who wrote Looks Good to Me, talked about how speaking at conferences had been great in her career. Open source contributions can look great. If you're still in school, look at your local CS club. Is there could you take a leadership position there? Lots and lots of stuff you can do, but I think you just got to remember that these people are seeing lots and lots of resumes. You got to think, well, what makes mine a little different from the crowd?
Absolutely. And if it's something you're passionate about, I mean, that's what I loved in the interview process. If somebody didn't have a ton of career experience, but they'd built something interesting, and then in the interview, we could talk about the weird stuff they learned or what they would go back and do differently, and shows that vulnerability that they have this sort of learning mindset. And I'll tell you too, I think we saw this in rework, but seen this elsewhere, that willingness to share, showing that you can write a blog post or speak on a topic, that's so important for interpersonal skills at the office. Can you, in 2 years or 3 years, are you going to be the one who can, with a lot of empathy, explain a complex system to a brand new employee that joins, right? That's important for the hiring process. And if you feel like maybe your skills are lacking in that area, that's where I would get career advice or mentoring, right? You reach out to somebody who's got a really cool blog that you love and be like, how do you have time for this? Or what's your process for coming up with ideas? I guarantee you that person will, first of all, probably doesn't get as many emails as you think they do.
Yes.
And will be flattered, but also like, it's one of these things where if they connect, they'll will. And if they're too busy or if it's a too weird of a question, they'll just ignore you. In worst case scenario, you just wrote an email out into the void.
We are acutely familiar with this phenomenon when we interview authors. We interview pretty much every author.
Most of them, yeah.
Sorry, not interview. Sorry, we email every author that we read. No, the authors who have come on have been wonderfully generous with their time. But that's the thing. It's like we never thought when we started this podcast that we'd get to meet cool people like Uncle Bob or Stephen Wolfram or Brian Kernahan or John Osterhout. But we just reached out and asked and said, hey, we love the book. Do you want to come on? And we've been totally shocked at how much headway we've made just from the simple reach outs. I don't want to get too reflective here because next week we are actually celebrating 1 year of Book Overflow. And so we'll dedicate a special episode and be a little more reflective in that episode. But we wanted to make sure that we talked about some of this job stuff, not necessarily during that episode, so it doesn't just become a Carter job therapy episode. But we did read a book this week. If you're listening and thinking, what, didn't they read a book this week? And yeah, it's topical for me because the at my new job, I'm going to be doing some more work with like kind of an AI native product. And so we thought this would be a great choice for this week. It is Thinking Like a Large Language Model by Mukund Sundararajan. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. Sorry, Mukund. But let's give you his author introduction from the book. It says, Mukund Sundararajan is a distinguished research scientist at Google DeepMind. He has spent the past decade analyzing, developing, and deploying AI in products successfully and unsuccessfully. He's also observed others do so. He currently works in the Gemini series of large language models and writes prompts for a living. I knew he was an engineer at Google. I did not realize he was a distinguished research scientist at Google DeepMind.
Big deal. And great author to have for a book like this.
Absolutely, yeah. Hard to find much more of an authority. Here's the book introduction. Consider an analogy. You are a manager, you have an employee, and you're trying to get a task done. This book explains LLM operations through 3 approaches: input-output examples, training process overviews, and familiar analogies, making it accessible to anyone with a high school education. Written by a Google DeepMind scientist who works on Gemini and writes prompts for a living, the book focuses on practical questions like how to phrase requests, whether to break tasks into steps, and what aspects of AI output need verification. It's essentially a guide for becoming an effective AI manager by understanding how your AI employee thinks, interprets requests, and responds to different prompting strategies. I'll include as a side note here before we get into our general thoughts. I appreciate the usage of the term LLM. I don't love how do you feel about this, Nathan? I don't love the term AI. I feel like there are, like video game, Pac-Man is AI, right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about kind of new stuff, I much prefer to use the term large language models, but I don't know. Is that just a me thing?
No, me too. Actually, I've been talking to a lot of, extended family during this trip. And it's funny because like, if you hear me on this podcast, I've been skeptical of a lot of the effectiveness of LLMs, but I sound like I'm like proselytizing LLMs to, over dinner and stuff. But a lot of it's because people have a lot of curiosity and the term isn't in general use. Think of people hear GPT, even though they don't know what that means because they hear ChatGPT. But large language models and like how that even functions. We sat down and talked about physics and all kinds of weird stuff. And then somebody asked about how large language models work. And luckily I could actually talk on this, at least from an armchair computer science standpoint. And they were just blown away about how things like, attention-based transformer work and the fact that it just scans basically the world's data and then finds associations between them. And it's just guessing the next token. These were all new concepts that, yeah, I think that it's important enough that we get clear in our vocabulary. Because what is it? AI is basically a meaningless term at this point.
Yeah.
And I think there is a subset of the stuff that we're really interested in that really is changing creative work in general, right? This happened recently. My wife is she's a writer, and she's been working on submitting some short stories.
Oh, nice.
And she's in a critique group that, they all critique each other's work, and they'll read stuff on a weekly basis. But she is very careful not to use large language models for any of her writing. It's not interesting to her. She likes to write, but she did try it out as a critique partner recently. She was using Claude. And just because I was like, hey, she was on a kind of a time crunch, and she wanted to kind of run some things by it. She loved it. It was actually, nice. And again, it was not an editor. It was not doing grammatical changes. It was mostly on like, did you pick up the theme, and did was the inciting incident, enough to get to the, whatever dramatic thing. And she found it to be incredibly effective. And I think we'll get into that in this book. Maybe I'll hop into my general thoughts.
Yeah. Why don't we go ahead?
Yeah. So I will say, I think I'm pretty sure this book's self-published.
I believe it is.
Okay. So what I think this book lacks is probably an editor's input.
Yes.
But I actually think once you get past, I think it has kind of like two things it's trying to do. One is to give a really basic introduction to a completely uninitiated person in the beginning of the book, which I didn't find very useful. But then the second half, and at first I was like, oh man, I don't know what we're going to do for the podcast for this, because I think it might just not be the appropriate. And then the middle starts talking about the inner workings of stuff, and it was more interesting. And then the final part was, hey, if you think of a large language model like this, then you might be able to get this output. And if you think of it like this, you might get this output. And it was, that part was the part where it was beautifully describing my experience of, as I've learned to interact with large language models, how I've gotten better results from the answers, sort of the real prompt engineering. And I think that, and I don't know, because Carter and I have not coordinated on this. I think if we focus on that part, this is going to be a great podcast episode.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting little psychological experiment for me, because when I was reading this book, I knew this was written by like a Google engineer, but I thought it was written by like, I don't know, some senior engineer on the ads team or whatever. And just someone who was like, hey, I'd like to write a book, and, large language models are hot. So here you go. And so I was kind of reading this book, and I had the same thought. Like, I agree, like this needed an editor. And I kind of came away, look, the book is short. It's like 110 pages.
Yeah.
And so, I kind of came away thinking there's some interesting nuggets in here, but you could have gotten those nuggets in like a 30-page book, or maybe a very long blog post. And I think an editor could have helped them catch that. And so I was kind of critical about it when reading it. Only now did I just realize, oh wait, this is a distinguished research scientist at Google DeepMind. And so I'm curious what my experience would have been if I had known that from the very beginning. For what it's worth, I think I read it correctly. I think I evaluated the ideas on the merits, but this made me think like, I wonder if there are any books that I'm maybe a little softer on, because I know like, oh, like this is written by a super fancy person.
Right. Like, is this Yoda speaking, or is this someone who just has simple speech? Right.
Like, exactly.
Yeah.
If you, I don't know why this is. I was watching. You ever watch Robot Chicken when you were younger?
Yeah, I did. That show's ridiculous. Yes.
It came up on my YouTube feed the other day for some reason. It's like E.T. and he like goes home, but you find out that like everyone else on E.T.'s planet like speaks normal. And, like he's just like, hey, how this guy get back here? Anyhow,
that's amazing.
It's not the most politically correct. It's very like 2000s edgy humor, but as someone who grew up with some of that stuff, but I was chuckling at it.
Speaking of, we're big fans of Tim and Eric. Awesome show, great job.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
And my daughter, she just started watching. It's not. I mean, some of it's absolutely not age appropriate for a 9-year-old, but maybe we're bad parents. She loves it though, and like it's our sense of humor. And
Oh
now I
yeah.
think she understands what these like inside jokes that my wife and I have had for years, and it's ridiculous. But yeah,
I love Tim and Eric. They're
yeah.
so stinking funny.
I've seen them live twice. I'm
Oh, have
that
you?
ridiculous. Oh yeah, I'm
Very
ridiculous. So
nice.
yeah.
Okay, well let's we'll take a quick break and then we'll get kind of into this book right after the break. And we are back. Thanks for listening, everyone.
So
Well, how
yeah,
about we yeah, let's go ahead and get started with our thoughts on this book.
so yeah, there's we're gonna breeze over the first couple sections. I'll kind of give a Cliff's Notes version, but I think the juicy part is going to be the mental models. I think for this audience especially, but the way the book builds up, and if you are starting from zero or you're recommending a friend start from zero, this first part might be useful, I guess. Maybe if you've lived under a rock for a little while. The book starts out with a section called LLM games, and it transitions to something they call background check. LLM games really starts with sort of like you put some prompts in and some answers come out, and it kind of says like, oh, LLMs are good at this, but they're bad at that. And they kind of the very basic stuff that you've probably heard about, like the strawberry problem and
Yeah,
counting things, and all the stuff that you probably shouldn't use LLMs for, at least especially if you don't know what you're doing. But I think a lot of people, and I ran into this last night with the conversations, people try to talk to LLMs in these very broad, creative ways. And then the LLM will just barf out stuff that doesn't make any sense half the time. And I was talking to them about, and I think maybe this book helped a lot with framing things. It basically takes that section and goes, okay, here's all these crazy things LLMs can do. It gets into the section called background check. And I'm getting Cliff's Notes on these first parts. The background check is kind of interesting. It talks about the anatomy of the large language model, pre-trained versus what they call like instruction-tuned models. And it was when we got to instruction-tuned models that things started getting interesting in the book, to me at least, where he basically saying, hey, and I've started doing this a lot myself, and I think if you look at anybody who's a power user, you basically come up with a sort of preamble of whatever you're going to ask the large language model with a bunch of tuning of like, I like this format. I want, a short response. I like it. It needs to have this as my audience. Like, you don't want to write that every time you talk to a large language model. So you'll tune it. You'll tune these instructions. And the thing is that every company that has a public facing large language model is tuning it before it even gets to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't talk about terrorist plots or, like how to do certain things. And so there's lots of tuning that goes in, and then like I said, I'll personally tune it for my stuff as well. And then it gets into chatbots and like how the conversational model of, when you actually add another prompt, it's actually reevaluating the entire thing, the conversation that you're having, which is why over time you might hit a limit and saying, hey, I can't analyze any more stuff, right? So we get into that kind of stuff. Again, if you're uninitiated, maybe this is just to be thorough and help make sure that your mental model of how they work isn't broken. But I think for someone like you and me, Carter, this was like complete. It was a nothing burger. Like
it was review. I mean, it was
yes.
interesting. I find the idea of tuning models very interesting. Like, and the book kind of makes the point, like, if you were to ask just a totally untuned model, just one that has been trained on all the text ever written, what was the weather today? It might spit out text like it's continuing that conversation, because that phrase, what is the weather today, might have only seen in like books that are like dialogues, right? And so it might it might just try to reproduce how those words and what follows them in the most accurate context. When you tune the model, and that's what the companies do, especially in a chatbot approach, they tune it so it understands that when a user asks a question, it expects like a conversational response. This is where like I think some of the challenges I have with this book is I'm not exactly sure who it's for, because like, again, it kind of seems a bit like it's for someone who's been sleeping under a rock for the past 3 years. But then, because we'd get to like the tuning part, I'm just like, oh man, I wish right now I was reading a book all about like tuning. In fact, after reading this book, we were texting Nathan, and I was like, we should read that paper, Attention is All You Need, right? Which is kind of like, it was back in 2017 by Google DeepMind, actually, which kind of invented the concept of the transformer. But that came about because as I was reading this book, I was like, dang, I wish I understood more. Like, yes, I get the high level stuff, but I wish I really understood more what is going on at that lower level.
Yeah. I would say, in light of this, and this has been really interesting, I've been using Claude to do like things like summaries and other stuff more recently, and you kind of have to break up your work because if the context window gets too large, it can't do the work.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other thing is, I have a greenfield project where I've actually been using Claude Code, which is the really interesting project that they have. It's a command line tool. It has access to an entire code repository, and it's an agent, right? It's agentic, so it can actually go in and make a bunch of changes, and you really are handling it like this. And what's interesting is it keeps optionally, and I like to keep it. I don't check it into version control because I don't really want that in there, but I'll have it's a Claude.md file, and it basically keeps working notes for itself of like the context, stylistically things that that I want, and it's human readable. Like I can read it, but it uses that to update its context window in a concise way, on like in basically instructions on how I want it to work. And I have a deep appreciation for this with this instruction tuned models, where it doesn't need to go back and read our entire chat history. That's actually not useful for it. But if it can summarize basically the successful outputs and keep good notes, it's just like with any career advice where you should be keeping a daily log of the work that you're doing. Claude does the same thing. And again, I've been very impressed with all these little hacks that as we've learned how to interact with these large language models. And again, I thought the same thing. I was like, man, I wish that they had started with maybe a quick overview and then jumped straight into instruction tuning, and then had like advanced hacks on ways that you can do stuff for instruction tuning. Yeah. So anyway, that's maybe for the version 2 of this book, where it's your wish list.
Well, so then we get to what I think we both agree was kind of the final most interesting section, which is mental models, which is, okay, how do you think of a large language model? And because he brings up kind of some interesting examples throughout the book, like for example, I think and what's tough with books like this is like the models are evolving so quickly that it's hard to know, like, well, which one was he talking to at a given point. But he, for example, says like, who is Sandy Obama?
Oh yeah, this was great.
Yeah, and then it'll like spit out like, oh, Sandy Obama is Obama's third daughter, and like makes up like a bunch of like nonsensical information. Like Obama has 2 daughters. Sandy Obama is not one of them, right? And then he kind of does it another way. So where first he asks the model, how many kids does Obama have? Then it'll list Sasha and Malia and give some basic biographical information about it. Then if you ask the model, who is Sandy Obama? It'll say, like within the same chat context, it'll say there is no Sandy Obama. And so it's kind of funny because as it, and there's a lot of that in the early part of the book, but like how you structure these prompts. But like once it kind of has that basic knowledge within the context of the chat, it doesn't hallucinate, but it does it's weird. I think that's so fascinating about large language models. Like we as programmers, like we've said for years that like computers are dumb. Like they just they do exactly what you tell them to do, and they follow an incredibly prescribed set of steps. And then all of a sudden large language models come along, and I'm not going to call them smart, but like it's so much fuzzier than it used to be, right? This idea that like you have to talk to it the right way so it doesn't hallucinate who Sandy Obama is. And so that's why he kind of lists these different mental models. And so he says the first way you can think of a large language model is as a human. But like in the Sandy Obama example, like that's funny because like you'd never meet a human who would act like that, who would say, in one conversation, give you biographical details about Sandy Obama, and then the next conversation, know that that's not a real person.
Yeah.
So
he has a great quote. I think he does a really good job of basically summarizing the entire chapter somewhere in the last paragraph. And for the thinking of a large language model as a human, he says, the model is trained on text from many humans. It knows vastly more than any one human, but it also lacks coherent lived experience of a single human. If you must think of the model as a human, it's best to think of it as a constellation of human-like entities. And again, that puts a lot of empathy for me in that when I've most successfully worked with large language models, I think of it as like an incredibly capable intern that we just hired that knows more than anybody I've ever met, but will also just lie to my face, right? So I always have to frame it so that it's more difficult for it to lie to me than it is for me to tell me what I want to find out. And that means that how I frame the question has to make it more painful for it to really, like, I should set the threshold of hallucination higher by asking and injecting a bunch of context of what I really am expecting from this, so that if it still hallucinates, it had to go over many, many barriers. And I think thinking models also help with this too. A lot of times, like especially if I'm interacting with Claude, it will sort of posit something, look up a piece of it, go back and kind of update that thing, maybe look up another piece, and then give me the real answer. And it's kind of automating some of this now. I think a year ago, the models would just kind of spew out whatever the next token was. And
did you see Apple and the paper they wrote recently about thinking models?
Yeah, about how it's not really thinking; it's just like tricking us. Yeah.
I haven't read the paper; I just read people talking about it. But I did see some commentary about around Apple being like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna make Apple intelligence. Oh, we couldn't do that. Whatever. This is all stupid anyhow.
We're gonna burn it down. Yeah, you're all idiots. Yeah, it's." I saw them. They recently were talking. I can't remember which tech journal it was. Apple was like, they're like, we spoke on AI for 100 minutes. In 8 minutes, we talked about AI features for Siri. In 4 of those minutes are features we did not ship. So it was only 4% of the features that and you're like, no one cares. Like like those are the 4 minutes that people really wanted, and you guys didn't ship it. So
that's like, yes, like I'm imagining like Apollo 13, but if it had actually blown up in space and been like, okay, we did almost everything right.
Right. I ate 100 meals. 8 of those meals I ate cake. 4 of those meals I ate 3 cakes in each sitting. And you're like, oh, okay. Well, it was only 4 meals that I ate 3 cakes. And you're like, okay, I mean, it doesn't matter to me. But,
Apple. We love you.
But, we love you.
Get your act together. Says 2 guys on a podcast.
Yeah.
Well, so then he talks about large language models maybe as a search engine, right?
Yeah, I like this one.
Yeah, right. I think because that's what's interesting with large language models. I'd be so curious to know kind of internally at Google, like how have they seen their traffic patterns develop in the era of large language models? Heaven knows that I Google things less than I used to. But as always with large language models, I mean, kind of the one of the key points he makes is about formatting. That with a large language model, he says, for a search engine, it is always the same list of links with snippets of text from the site. With large language models, we can control the output format, which is obviously a very valuable thing with large language models. I think the nice thing about a search engine is it doesn't hallucinate. And I know that it'll be funny because I'll have moments where I'm like, I'm going to ask ChatGPT this question. I'll know it's the kind of question that you should probably look up like on Google instead. And then I find myself thinking like, I don't care if it hallucinates a bit. I'm like, then why are you looking this up?
Right. No, I'm in the same conundrum where I'm like, it's so convenient. And he really hones in on this that I think is probably an intuition that I had, but I hadn't expressed it in words. Let's say you have a complex query that you knew that you're going to actually have to do 2 or 3 Google searches to find the answer, right? So the year, what was the closest year? Yeah.
Who was the president of India when Jesse Owens won his gold medals at the Olympics?
Exactly. In which you're like, that could come up at a trivia night, or you have a friend who has a thing, and you're arguing about the order of events that happen in some historical context, and you of course can look that up. You can look up those things. But a large language model, if you prompt correctly, can do that in a single query because it has all the associative data. The only problem is it's like a roll of the dice where you're like, did you just make this up? Was there even an Olympics that year? And sometimes I'll have to go in and like do that more complex query and then go, okay, let me spot check that this actually was when the Olympics was. Let me spot check that this is the right Jesse Owens thing. If I really care about it, if I only kind of care about it, I'll be like, yeah, I'm like, vibe coding. It's like vibe searching. So I'll just run with it. But I found though for technical documentation, it does an amazing job. So this was turned on to me from a security researcher years ago. probably a year and a half ago, actually, and things have gotten a lot better. He was like, you know what? Sometimes I want to know what what's the payload format for some TCP call for whatever, right? Some super technical thing, because he's trying to do pen testing or whatever. And he could Google it and then search through this like 20-page technical document and try to find the one spot in the RFC that has the thing. Or he can ask a large language model and it would give him like exactly what he was looking for. And even if he needed to spot check that it wasn't lying to him, it gave him such a clear thing to look for that when he did the Google search was faster too, right? And that was the kind of piece where I'm asking it some deeply technical thing and it can just like hone down. And then I verify, right? So I hone down and verify. And that as a search engine, I think this is really powerful. And actually, I was at an AI startup that was doing more advanced optical character recognition. The company ended up getting acquired by Figma. And it was interesting is the first time I'd heard about large language models as an amazing database query tool was from the CEO. He's a super genius guy. He has another startup now that's in the AI testing space. But I'd never heard anyone speak about how, yes, sometimes it'll give you factually untrue results. But if you just look at it from a query result performance standpoint, on the amount of vastness of data, nothing can compete, right? From an associative query standpoint, it's faster. The whole of human civilization, you can ask it a question, it spits out something that's more times than not correct, is nuts. Like it's absolutely nuts that you have this at your fingertips.
I wonder, has anyone like, I say like you should make this like a game show, but I don't know if that's even the right phrase. But like I love if like a YouTube channel had done something where like get a group of like product managers, like people who kind of fancy themselves like technical, they understand like the product side of it, maybe professional vibe coders, prompt engineers or whatever. And I would just be so curious, people who don't really have like a software engineering background, and just like have them build something like and that could even be something like, right, like maybe it's a Facebook clone or something like that. But I'd just be so curious. Again, I think I mentioned this on a podcast but recently, but I had a buddy who has a marketing consultancy. He needed to do a project for someone came and wanted him to build like a website as part of it, right? And he said in the past, there's like, he'd be like, no way. But he's like, I know ChatGPT. Like I've got GitHub Copilot installed. Let me take a whack at it. And like, it was interesting because yes, he was able to get a lot further than he would have without large language models. Like he had a working website, but then he was having a trouble with like a discount code logic. And so he's like, Carter, I can't prompt my way out of this. Can you come in and, do this for me? And I was happy to. And just looking at the website, I was like, what the heck is this? Like, this is insane.
Right.
And so I'd be so curious to watch, like, how far could you get someone who has like zero technical knowledge, but a decent product understanding? Like, because I'm not talking about just like getting it up and running in your browser. I'd be so curious, like, can these people get it deployed to AWS? Can they get it minorly scalable? Like, I think that'd be so fascinating to like give it to 5 people and watch that process.
We're going to put this out in the universe because I have a way that I think you could do the structure of it, which is if you came in with a formally defined API, meaning everyone had to, you had a user creation process, a checkout process.
Yeah.
Those were formally defined, because what we could do is you could, as the game, you could write fitness functions to formally verify, or not, I shouldn't say formal verification. You could verify that all the expected behavior of your app works or doesn't, right? So I can create users, I can delete users, I can, whatever, add inventory, remove inventory. But it would be really cool too, because then I would also want to have like pen testers come in and be like, can I do cross-site scripting? Can I like, is the large language model actually deploying unsafe, scary code that even though it passes all the tests, you're actually like putting your company at risk because its examples are a bunch of bad examples from the internet. And so
I just don't have the time to make this, nor do I even know who I would recruit to be part of it. But like who wants to be a vibe coder? Like that's what it would be. This would also funny. Like
it would also be cool. What was it? Was it John Henry who like competed against the the myth of John Henry like competing against the machine on who could get through a mountain faster? that would be cool is vibe coder versus
Oh yeah,
10x
versus like
10x
yeah, yeah.
programmer, and see like, given the same constraints, given the same API outputs in the same time period, who makes a better version of it? You know, is it
Ooh, I
so?
like that. That you could do in like a day, and like if you were
Yeah.
just to film it, because I like that idea, but I also like the idea of like a long form series of like you keep checking in and like but again, I just don't know who I'd get that. I got to get some like students at a local university and be
No,
like, okay,
this was a cool idea too, because like you'd have to overcome things like overcoming tech debt. Because one of
yeah,
the
yeah.
problems, right, is that yeah, the vibe code will prototype it out pretty quickly, but is it maintainable, right? Is it following Kent Beck's ideas and these other things? But
We should go
could
to venture
you?
capitalists and say, I want to make a game show. Are you guys
Yeah,
funding game shows right now?
yeah. Oh, that's really funny. That would be.
Okay, well, ideas. If you're a content creator and you shamelessly steal that idea, we won't blame you because we want to watch this
And if
video.
you want a couple of hosts who can just go
There we
completely
go.
off topic, we'll come
Yeah.
in and be like,
um, okay, neat. So then we talk about large language models as n-gram models. I mean, do you want to talk about this one? This one's a little weird.
yeah. So I think what he's trying to frame here is that, yeah, there's like Ingram and nearest neighbors. I think he's like overlaying it of like, how does this compare to these other AI tools? I actually didn't write any notes about Ingram because I'm gonna like hop over it because I think I'd get roasted by folks that are actually good AI engineers. But you know, I kind of lumped it together with nearest neighbor because uh, there's some similarities in the approach. But he says it seems to use more abstract form of analogical reasoning to relate to the task to its training data. Like all mental models, our n-gram and nearest neighbor mental models are simplifications and do not explain everything. And I think basically like these were earlier reasoning models. So like nearest neighbor and n-gram had the ability to do these like associative tree crawling and all this kind of interesting stuff. These amazing like sort of decision tree stuff that comes out of these. And again, if I'm screwing this up, roast me. Um, but when you would take an AI class, I think even at Georgia Tech right now, if you take an AI class, you're spending a lot of time looking at what are considered like outdated
Yeah,
models.
yeah.
But they actually are still useful for certain types. If you have a very, if the scope of the data in the domain that you're actually making decisions on are finite, then these other kind of models can be really effective, and they're very fast, and they can have high accuracy. Of course, large language models are more generally useful. And so I think his argument here was basically like, it isn't saying large language is n-gram or nearest neighbor. It's like, oh, you're coming from the mental model of nearest neighbor. How does large language model tie into this? And again, I think it's a fuzzier version of a lot of these. It's surprising what a large language model can infer and come out with, even though it's not been trained at that particular type of analysis.
Yeah. I'm getting ahead of myself here because there's a point I want to make, but it doesn't make sense to make it right at this moment. Maybe so we talk about large language models as neural networks, and then
Which,
as
yeah,
right, like
they are. So that's the
they
funny
are,
thing.
yeah, exactly.
He gets to it. He's like, oh, think of it as a neural network. And you're like, actually, it's a very specialized, form of it. And it's obviously, these what they call like unsupervised learning,
Yeah.
right? That's the big thing about it.
Yeah, I mean, he says what he says in summary, we understand humans by examining their experience and background, possibly by understanding their motivations and incentives, not by examining the neurons in their brain. And so it is with large language models, basically saying like, yeah, this is how a large language model is structured, but like he says, even the smallest large language model is going to have 1 billion parameters, and
Right.
each one of those parameters forms kind of the identity of the large language model. And so understanding how each one of those neurons works is interesting, but not maybe incredibly helpful in helping the end user understand how to best work with a large language model. He talks about them as programmable computers, which again we kind of talked about, like how funny it is that they're so fuzzy that it's not as declarative as a programming language. He says a good prompt engineer must be familiar with the LLM's default behavior, knowing what details to include and which ones to omit. A prompt engineer can learn the default behavior and capabilities of an LLM iteratively. a good mental model of an LLM is as helpful to a prompt engineer as a mental model of a programming language is to a software engineer. And I think, that kind of goes to that idea of like, you use the right language for the job. Don't ask a large language model to do something it's not great at, right? Like, don't try to build your front end web app in Go, right? That doesn't mean Go is a bad language. I mean, it's not suited for that particular job,
Right.
unless you're using HTMX.
Right. Or the funny thing too, if you did ask it to do that, it might even get creative and say, oh, okay, well, I'll build a WebAssembly runtime.
Yeah.
And you're like, why did you do all this? But um, it is interesting. I think I don't know if you spoke on it, but you had talked about how you don't like the term prompt engineer. Do you want to speak on that?
Yeah. I turned down a company because I saw on their LinkedIn that they had someone whose title was prompt engineer. And I was just like,
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about that. Like, I just think, look, no disrespect. Well, okay, a little disrespect to our prompt engineers out there. If you fancy yourself a prompt engineer, it just strikes me a little bit as someone who wants the glory without any of the hard work. Like, I get there is an art to constructing good prompts. Absolutely. But there's also like an art to writing good Slack messages to your coworkers, right? And like if I said like, "Oh, what's your job?" I say like, "I'm a Slack message engineer." It's like that's not a job. That's a component of a job. And so I think sometimes people say like
Yeah.
prompt engineer, they say like, "Well, I've got I'm very good at this particular task, and so that's what makes me very valuable." And I'm not saying that it's not a good task to be valuable at. I just think it's one small component of what it takes to be an engineer. And so I think when someone says like a prompt engineer, I'm like, I think you're missing the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
That's interesting. I think I have the same critique of folks who have a title of like DevOps engineer.
I
And
agree.
lots of folks do it because I'm like, to me, it's a short-sightedness of the company itself. It's not if you took a job as a DevOps engineer, I don't blame you. You're probably doing all kinds of cool stuff. I guarantee you're doing a lot more than just DevOps.
Yeah.
And same thing with a prompt engineer. I think a good prompt engineering is, yeah, sure. If your company uses these in their workflows, yeah, it's a part of the job. But I think the best prompt engineers are probably incredibly capable software engineers.
Yeah.
Who happen to understand how to carve out instructions. They're basically an engineering manager. And I think that was the other thing this book kind of buried the lead on, which is that, really what these expectations are is that we are all expected to be managers, but not necessarily of humans, right?
Yeah.
And that's really what this is that, hey, can I manage sort of the drudgery of certain aspects, or can I have a pair programming buddy who helps me, think through problems? And yeah, the programmable computer thing is interesting. I will ask it little things, and maybe this is just my bias, but like I'm afraid I don't like it. I tried vibe coding one time. I don't like it. Like I don't like it. And I feel like it's too much out of my control. I also think I have like too many opinions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I slightly changed that with using Claude Code, where I'm a little more hands-on, and it has the ability to fundamentally refactor stuff. So like I was doing something in JavaScript, they started using classes, and I was like, absolutely not. Like, you're not using classes. Like I want it in this style. And it went back and rewrote it in a functional style.
Nice.
That needed what I wanted. And it was like pretty good. I realized that I think some of it was the context it was missing. It was the Claude.md that it was missing. But it was also the fact that like I even rewrote some of the code and then asked it to do stuff like what I just wrote for it. Again, just like a pair programming session might be between a senior engineer and a junior dev, right? And I was like, okay, I think we're actually onto something. Like I'm okay with this. I'm okay with describing some deeper philosophical thing or why we write code this way, and then it actually takes those notes and runs with it. Before that, it was kind of like a toy that I thought was silly. I was just like, I'm spending as much time, undoing the crap that it's spitting out than otherwise.
Yeah, I vibe coded like a total greenfield project, and I found it started to get stressful because I was just like, I don't quite know what's on the page here. Like, I'm glad that it's quote unquote working.
Right.
But I also did find even when I was vibe coding, there were several times, more often than not, where I say, no, don't do it that way. Do it like you were talking about, like it did it in classes.
Mm-hmm.
I want it functional. And even in my experiences with the vibe coding, I'm just like, how are people doing this if they're not actually software engineers? Because like I find that I
No,
have to babysit this thing like crazy.
I guarantee you
But
it's awful. And
yeah,
so
honestly, right? Again,
it
I've seen a vibe coded project and like impressive that there is technology that can let a completely non-technical person get to that point.
right.
That's crazy. Holy cow. Right. Like just
It's worse is better on steroids is what
yeah.
like
Well,
because if you get to market faster, if you actually get paying customers, it might be that you're in a compliance nightmare. It might be that
yeah.
you're literally putting everyone's credit card data at risk and all these
Mhm.
horrible things, the things that we have to think about as software engineers. If you're vibe coding this and you're really just trying to get some product to market, get on product hunt and, make a bunch of
Mhm.
money, um, those aren't in alignment with your values. And if you can move faster than me, who, quote unquote builds it right,
Mhm.
who wins? Like
Yeah, absolutely.
it's the worst implementation that wins, right?
I'm getting prepared for that with my new job just because like they have like some goals like they started out on Azure because this company they have like a partnership with LinkedIn, and so LinkedIn's a Microsoft company, and so they got a lot of Azure credits, but they ran out of Azure credits, and it's just like it's hard to find like startup devs who are also Azure devs. Like Azure is very much like the big enterprise thing, so they're moving to AWS, right? Like, and that's I confirmed that with them, like that they're in the process of migration, but they're kind of like there, but obviously like moving to AWS doesn't make you any money. And so I need to kind of feel that out as I join because I'm like, how's it going? They're like, it's going, but we don't have the resources. And so I'd love to join and be like, hey, like I can do this. Like I'm happy to kind of spearhead the AWS migration. But it's also one of those things that's like, well, is that the thing you want to do when you first join? Work on something that isn't making the company money? I don't know. I still got to think through it. I'll talk to my boss on Monday about it. Um, let's talk about the last one, large language model as an employee. And we've kind of touched on this a bit. But I think you're right. Like that's how we all kind of have to treat it. From a non-technical perspective, I thought it was interesting. There's a Substack I subscribe to that's like political in nature or policy driven, and the guy does a Q&A every Friday, and someone asked him and said like, do you use large language models in your writing? Because he turns out an article every day. And he said, he's like, no, because I have been doing this for a really long time. It's important for me to keep my voice. He's like, I use it occasionally, but like, I don't use it as a, to like generate the writing for me. But I thought this was interesting what he said. He said, there's a type of kind of like old school journalist in when newsrooms were larger and better funded, where they aren't very good at writing. What they're really good at is like working the phones, so to speak. Like they have a lot of contacts and they'll go out and kind of
Hmm.
hit the pavement and get the information. And then they would forward that information to the actual journal, like, the writers. And then they would turn that into an article. And so there was a good partnership there. Just saying, in this day and age, newsrooms aren't as well funded. There's not as much room for someone like that who is just really good at getting all of the information. You need to do that and write. He was saying that there could be an opening with large language models for someone like that. If that person wanted to start their kind of own like Substack, where they could leverage those skills, but then use the large language model to actually kind of generate the content quickly. Um, I thought that was interesting and kind of goes to that idea
Yeah.
of like treating a large language model as an employee. It depends on what you're building or what you're trying to create, but
Yeah.
that's one way you could leverage it.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it too. Is like, where's the primary value that you're contributing to the company? And if that primary value is like you're just completely handing that off to a large language model, your job probably is at risk.
Yeah, yeah.
If you're using large language models as a force multiplier for meeting your obligations and expectations of the role, but it's actually the deep creative work that you're coming to the company with, I don't think your job's at risk, right? Like to me, that's the real piece here is that yes, certain types of data entry people are probably going to go away.
Hmm.
Certain types of middle managers are probably going to go away. Like I think those are very large language model automatable type things. Like I don't need 3 layers of middle managers
Hmm.
because I can have it assess this and kind of weigh in and do stuff. Um, and I also think that in some big companies they will reduce headcount because they're steady state, right? They're in that sort of mature
Hmm.
spot. But I think early stage, and I hadn't heard about this until recently, there was VCs that were really excited about large language models because they were basically saying, if you've got a radical new idea and you've got a young workforce who is like very capable of using large language models, you're not going to reduce your hiring. You're going to move faster. And so what's going to happen is you're going to get the same funding that you had before, but this time it comes with agentic models being managed by a bunch of young software engineers who are going to just move 10x faster than they used to. And I think it was Anthropic. I think it's a good thing to talk about here too. Anthropic recently had a sort of a prediction, and I think it's really cool because it's verifiable whether it's going to be true or not. Anthropic said they think by the end of 2026, the first billion-dollar acquisition of a solo operated company will happen.
Oh, interesting.
And I think that I think that's completely plausible, right? I think that some young, amazing, super smart person who has a cool new idea that's very disruptive could plausibly do this with no staff other than themselves and get acquired by one of the big tech companies for $1 billion because they just
interesting.
And it's like, it's exciting actually. Like if I look at that, I go, you know what? Because I remember, years ago, Instagram, right, was purchased for $1 billion, 12 employees, right?
Yeah.
It's not that it's not possible to get a company that's that high of a valuation. And I don't think that was a waste of money for Meta, right? They obviously saw the writing on the wall of user adoption and the way that people want to interact with photos at the time, but now photos and video. I think somebody's going to latch onto something and move really fast. And I think it's going to be nuts, right? You're going to be a 22-year-old, at least 500 millionaire or whatever, depending on what funding you had, because of some execution path that you had with large language models. That's crazy. That's wild.
I know I like when people make predictions and kind of, that are falsifiable. And I think that's a good advice for anyone is if you can find, if you're following anyone online and you find they're making predictions that are falsifiable and then they don't come true, and then they're not reevaluating, right? We all make predictions that don't happen and don't come true. That's fine, right? But I find that there are too many people online that are just confidently making predictions all the time and never seem to reckon with the fact that they're wrong most of the time. And so, but I think on the topic of junior engineers, I am curious because the startup I joined, I think it's like an engineering team of like 7. I think I'm like an engineer number 7 or 8, but everyone's been hired within like the last 6 months. Like, they kind of got Series A funding, I think like 9 months ago or so. Wow. And so they've been ramping up. But I'm really curious because this company, they actually have a really strong belief in hiring junior engineers. Like for a startup, it's the org structure is more what you would anticipate, where like it's a team of like 7 engineers, but like 3 or 4 of them are junior engineers, and then you have like 2 kind of senior engineers, and then me, who's more like a staff level engineer, which is rare in a startup. Usually startups like only hire senior engineers, but they've said that they hire junior engineers in part because of large language models, because a junior engineer can get much more effective much more quickly with a large language model. Now, I personally am biased because we have some great universities here in Utah, and they're all kind of like really weirdly close to each other. And most of these engineers come from my alma mater, and so I think they're great.
That's amazing.
But we'll see as I join, just kind of what it's like working with them.
I'll be fascinated, and this is again, here's my falsifiable prediction. I have a feeling, and this will be interesting to see how the culture at your new company has built up, which is one of the things I love about junior engineers is they don't know that certain things are considered impossible. So they'll come in with a kind of a new perspective, and it might be that the status quo says, "Hey, you don't build things this way," and they do it anyway, and they kind of prove it. But they're also going to run into the fact that they're going to basically bike shed something that's not bike shedding, right?
Yeah.
The other nice thing though is that you're going to say you're going to have the Chesterton's fence thing, which is that something was built a certain way and no one remembers why. And you're going to come in and be like, and it was some design decision that was made when there was 3 people in the company, and no one knows. Like everyone's afraid to touch it. Everyone's doing this and that, and so I think those are from somebody like your level, knowing when to come in and say, you know what, this isn't serving us anymore. And I think if we do this new pattern, this is actually going to help, reduce the number of errors that we're shipping or whatever, right? That's the fun role to play as like a more senior person, is that you have the experience of these larger patterns, and when you find it, it's really cool because all of a sudden the quality of work from everybody increases, and you're like, okay, this is why I'm here. This is really fun.
I'm excited. It's going to be fun. Well, wait, why don't we round out our thoughts on the book? Nathan, what are you going to do differently in your career as a result of reading the book?
Yeah, I liked so the big thing I took out of this book is I love the framing of honing my prompt engineering skills through little experiments, right? So doing something where I think it should give me a result that I'm looking for, and then verifying whether it actually does this. And you don't just do this with a single prompt. You probably, because there's some randomness in here. But playing with my assumptions and my mental models, this book kind of inspired me to go, you know what? I should always be poking and prodding at my understanding because I might be limiting myself. And so that's a little more woo-woo, but yeah, that's what I'm going to shoot first and better testing my assumptions.
Nice. I mentioned I'm joining this startup. They have a good profitable business, but it's not really AI related. And right now they're trying to build out what they think is a complementary AI component to it. And so that's one thing I'm going to be helping with. I could see as I start to build that, maybe needing to refine my prompts. I could see using some of the advice here in this book from that. So I guess that's kind of the most applicable use case I've got. And then, who would you recommend the book to?
Yeah. If you're struggling to effectively use large language models, and you're a software engineer, I think the second half of this book is actually worth a read. It's only, I think that, or not even second half, the final mental model section, I think it's like the last 35, 40 pages of the book. Not a huge time investment, but actually it punches above its weight class as far as like it helped me with thinking through things. If you want to read it end to end, or if you want to recommend to like maybe like a school teacher or something on like how they could use it for, rubrics for their class or something, they might want to start all the way from the beginning and like kind of a geeky way of doing this. But is this an authoritative way to become a 10x large language model user? It's not what this book is, right?
Yeah.
I think I don't want to, I liked the second half of this book. And by the time I got through that, I was like, okay, there's a there, right? But it's not for everybody. If you've been very skeptical of large language models and maybe you're kicking and screaming you have to implement it at work, the mental model piece of this would be useful. Like you'll be better at doing it. So that's my input.
Yeah, I this is one of the ones where it's been harder for me to like. Who do I recommend this book to? I wrote aspiring prompt engineers. I just it's different parts of the book are great for different people. The book as an entirety, like we said, this world of self-publishing is really cool because you get a lot of books that people wouldn't be able to write otherwise. I mean, Georges Oraz's the Software Engineer's Guidebook, like he talks about how it was kind of his dream to work with an O'Reilly or a Manning, and then they weren't interested, and he self-published, and it's a great book, and we're all glad we have it. This book could have benefited from an editor, just to kind of tighten it up and make it a little more clear. Like, is this for beginners? Is this for experienced engineers? I'm not exactly sure. So yeah, as far as who I recommend this book to, like, I don't know. I could see like if you're very, very junior and like you work at a company that is really hammering like AI usage, like, hey, you've got to make sure you're using AI. Like, this could be an interesting book to pick up.
Right.
Aside from that, tough to know exactly who I'd recommend it to. But
yeah,
we read a lot on this podcast, and we like some books more than others, and that's okay.
I would love to see this author do what Kent Beck did, which was he started publishing the chapters as like premium content on a Substack, and then got industry feedback to create Tidy first. I think that I think the author here would have been able to get feedback and say, oh, this is what's resonating. Because I would love to see a V2 of this, or maybe a more advanced version, because obviously the author is got all the credibility in the world.
No, and absolutely.
I would love to see them go, oh, and here's this wacky, crazy thing that we're doing in the lab, and you have no idea what's coming out next. Like, I want to be excited about that. So, yeah.
Well, we'll see what Mukund gets up to, because obviously very, very intelligent guy. Lots of strong writing in this book. I believe this is his kind of freshman effort, and so excited to see what the sophomore attempt might look like. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll wrap it up for this week. Just I know if I always sometimes leave some of the more intimate stuff at the end for our fans, or not intimate, but like inside baseball kind of stuff. You'll start to hear on some episodes coming up soon some ads. We are excited that we have our first official sponsor. We tend to be pretty choosy with how we monetize this podcast. We just view the credibility we have with you, the listener, as very, very important, and we don't want to like be advertising like soap or towels or anything like that.
Athletic greens, VPNs.
Exactly, right. Yeah. So we're excited about the sponsor we have coming up. It's a development tool. Interesting stuff there. So you'll start to hear ads. I mean, it's no secret that like obviously we'd love to make money off this podcast, and so if you start noticing some more monetization plays in the future, we hope that you will indulge that and understand that Nathan and I are human, and as much as we love making this podcast, it'd also be nice if it, at the very least, covered the cost of the books. So keep your ear out for that. But it's a fun milestone for this podcast. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, or know someone who is, or just want to talk to us, again, contact at bookoverflow.io. That's how you can reach out to us. We love when we get messages from you guys. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You find the podcast on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. You find Nathan's work with his newsletter, Functionally Imperative, at functionallyimperative.com. And that takes us to the end for this week. Thanks for listening, folks, and we'll see you around.
See ya.